Under the dim glow of the flickering fluorescent lights in the hallways of Blackridge High, there was an unspoken rule whispered among students: don't stay after school alone. The story always started the same. Decades ago, there had been a fire in the library. A teacher, Miss Klein, had tried to save a group of students trapped in a study room. Witnesses claimed they saw her pounding on the glass from the inside, but no one could get to them. When the flames consumed the room, the screams echoed through the halls, and some swore the sound never truly left the building. Of course, most students dismissed the tale as a spooky urban legend. That is, until Jenna's senior year. Jenna was a straight-A student, a bit of a loner, and the kind of person teachers trusted to stay late organizing class projects. That's why, on a cold October evening, she didn't think twice about staying behind to work on the upcoming science fair. Her chemistry teacher, Mr. Alden, had handed her the keys to the lab, jokingly warning, "Don't let the ghosts keep you." She laughed it off, but as she watched him leave, a strange unease settled over her. The school was eerily quiet when she stepped into the hallway to grab something from her locker. Her sneakers squeaked against the polished floors, and the sound echoed unnervingly. Somewhere, a clock ticked loudly, each second slicing through the stillness. She tried to shake off the feeling that she was being watched, chalking it up to her overactive imagination. Then she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps. Jenna froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She turned, expecting to see the janitor or maybe another teacher, but the hallway was empty. Her heart hammered in her chest as she called out, "Hello? Mr. Alden?" No response. She shook her head, scolding herself for being jumpy, and made her way back to the lab. But when she reached the door, it was slightly ajar. She was certain she had closed it behind her. A shiver crept up her spine as she pushed it open and stepped inside. Her neatly organized materials were scattered across the counter. Broken glass sparkled under the harsh lab lights, and a cold draft brushed past her, though the windows were sealed shut. Her breath came out in short, shallow gasps as she stared at the mess, trying to piece together what could have caused it. That's when the lights flickered. The overhead bulbs buzzed violently, plunging the room into brief flashes of light and dark. And in one of those fleeting moments, she saw it. A figure standing at the back of the lab. It was a woman in a charred, tattered dress, her skin blackened and cracked like burned wood. Her eyes were hollow pits, and smoke seemed to curl from her lips as she whispered, "Help me." Jenna screamed and bolted from the room, her footsteps slapping against the tiles as she ran. The hallway seemed endless, stretching on forever, as the fluorescent lights above her buzzed and flickered erratically. Shadows danced on the walls, some of them moving in ways that didn't match her own frantic motions. She reached the main doors and yanked at the handle, but they wouldn't budge. Locked. She tried the side exits, locked. Panic clawed at her throat as she fumbled for her phone, but the screen was dead, no matter how many times she pressed the power button. Behind her, she heard the sound of whispering. It started low, almost inaudible, but it grew louder, like dozens of voices murmuring in unison. She turned slowly, her back pressed against the door. The hallway was empty, but the whispers continued, growing closer, surrounding her. Her eyes darted to the glass trophy case nearby. In its reflection, she saw them, shadowy figures filling the hallway, their faces obscured, but their forms unmistakably human. They stood motionless, watching her, their heads tilted unnaturally to the side. And then they moved. They surged toward her, their footsteps impossibly loud, like thunder in the confined space. Jenna screamed, throwing herself down a side corridor. Her lungs burned, and her legs felt like they would give out, but she didn't dare stop. She ducked into the library, slamming the door shut behind her. The air in the library was thick with the smell of smoke, and Jenna felt a sudden, suffocating heat. She turned, and her blood ran cold. The once empty study room in the corner was now engulfed in flames, but there was no fire alarm, no sprinklers, just the sound of screams, high-pitched, desperate, and echoing from the inferno. And standing in the middle of the flames was Miss Klein. Her charred hand reached out, her blackened lips moving as she rasped, "Why didn't you save us?" Jenna stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen chair. She hit the ground hard, pain jolting up her arm, but she didn't care. The flames were spreading, crawling along the carpet and walls, and the heat was unbearable. She scrambled to her feet and ran, not stopping until she burst through a side exit that inexplicably opened this time. cold night air hit her like a wave, and she collapsed on the grass outside, sobbing uncontrollably. The next day, the school was abuzz with rumors. Some said they saw fire trucks outside the building, though there was no sign of damage. Others claimed Jen had been found wandering the parking lot, muttering incoherently about shadows and flames. Jenna transferred schools shortly after, but Blackridge High never let go of its secrets. To this day, students still whisper about the fire and the woman in the library, warning newcomers to never, ever stay after dark. It all started with a dare, a simple, stupid dare that no one thought would spiral out of control. Ridgewood High, tucked away in a quiet town, was infamous for one thing: Room 217. The classroom had been locked and abandoned for years, its door reinforced with heavy chains, the window blinds permanently drawn. Students whispered about a tragedy that happened there, though no one knew the full story. All they knew was that the school never reopened it, and the janitor wouldn't even clean near the door. Mia, Alex, and Jason thought it was the perfect setting for a little Halloween thrill. They were juniors with a taste for adrenaline, and Jason, the loudest of the bunch, suggested they break into the room after school. Mia rolled her eyes but agreed, not wanting to seem like the only one scared. Alex, quiet but curious, nodded reluctantly. As the final bell rang and the hallways emptied, the trio hid in the supply closet until the janitor finished his rounds. The school took on an eerie silence, the kind that amplified every creak and groan of the old building. At 7 p.m., they emerged, armed with flashlights and the bolt cutters Jason had stolen from his dad's garage. Room 217 was at the end of the science wing, and even from afar, it gave off an unsettling aura. The closer they got, the heavier the air seemed to become, almost as if the room itself was alive, waiting for them. Jason laughed nervously as he snipped the chains, the sound echoing through the hallway like a gunshot. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing complete darkness. "Ladies first," Jason joked, nudging Mia. She rolled her eyes but stepped inside, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The room smelled stale, like mildew and old books. Desks were overturned, and the chalkboards still bore faint marks of equations long erased. It was as if time had stopped the day it was sealed. Alex noticed it first. A faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. "Probably rats," Jason said, though his voice lacked conviction. The scratching grew louder. Mia swung her flashlight toward the source, illuminating the teacher's desk in the corner. The drawers rattled slightly, as if something inside was trying to get out. "Okay, joke's over. Who rigged this?" Mia said, her voice trembling. Jason raised his hands in mock surrender. "Not me." Before they could investigate further, the door slammed shut behind them. Mia screamed and spun around, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Alex and Jason joined her, but the door seemed frozen in place. Their flashlights flickered simultaneously, and the room was plunged into near darkness, save for a faint red glow emanating from the teacher's desk. "What the hell is that?" Alex stammered, pointing. The desk drawers burst open, papers and books flying out and scattering across the room. The red glow intensified, and for a brief moment, they saw it, a figure standing behind the desk. It was a man, or at least it had been. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow sockets that seemed to drink in the light. His hands were charred, fingers ending in sharp, jagged nails. "Get out!" the figure growled, its voice like gravel grinding against metal. Jason screamed, backing into a desk that toppled over with a deafening crash. The figure moved toward them, its steps unnaturally jerky, as if it hadn't walked in years. Alex yanked Mia by the arm, dragging her toward the windows. "Help me break this!" he shouted, slamming a chair against the glass. The glass didn't even crack. Jason was frozen in place, staring at the figure as it closed the distance between them. "What do you want?" he cried. The figure tilted its head, almost amused, before lunging forward. Jason let out a blood-curdling scream as the creature's hand closed around his throat, lifting him off the ground effortlessly. His skin began to blister and blacken where it touched him, smoke rising as if he were being burned alive. Mia and Alex screamed, pounding on the walls and windows, desperate for any way out. The creature turned its hollow gaze toward them, dropping Jason's lifeless body to the floor with a sickening thud. The lights flickered violently as it began to move toward them, its mouth twisting into an unnatural grin. In a last-ditch effort, Alex grabbed a fire extinguisher and hurled it at the creature. The extinguisher passed right through it, shattering against the wall. The creature laughed, a guttural, chilling sound that echoed in their bones. "Run!" Mia screamed, dragging Alex toward the far corner of the room where a supply closet door stood ajar. They stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind them. It was pitch black, the air thick with the scent of rot. They held their breath, listening as the footsteps approached. The creature stopped just outside the closet. They could hear its labored breathing, the sound of nails dragging across the door. Then it whispered, "You can't hide forever." Suddenly, the closet door was yanked open and Mia screamed, but there was nothing there. The hallway lights flickered on and they found themselves standing in an empty room. No overturned desks, no papers scattered on the floor, and no sign of Jason. The door to room 217 creaked open on its own, revealing the janitor standing outside with a flashlight. "What the hell are you kids doing here?" he growled, his face pale. Mia and Alex tried to explain, but the words caught in their throats. When the janitor stepped into the room, his flashlight beam revealed a single desk in the center. On it was Jason's flashlight, still on, and a charred handprint burned into the wood. No one ever saw Jason again, and room 217 was resealed the next morning. To this day, students say they hear scratching sounds and muffled screams late at night, coming from behind that locked door. Hollow Creek High had always been a place where stories of ghosts and tragedies were whispered, but none were more chilling than the tale of the Watcher in the Gym. It started with a tragedy years ago. A star basketball player, Ethan Cole, had died during a championship game. No one knew exactly how. Some said it was a heart attack, others claimed he collapsed after a freak accident. The only detail everyone agreed on was that his body had been found in the locker room, staring blankly at the ceiling, his eyes wide open in terror. Most students laughed off the rumors, but there were strange occurrences tied to the gym. Balls bouncing when no one was around, doors slamming shut on their own, and shadows flitting across the high rafters. Despite these oddities, the school carried on, treating the gym like any other place, until one Friday night. A group of students, led by Sarah, Darren, and Lindsay, stayed late after the homecoming dance to clean up the decorations. It was supposed to be a quick job, just taking down streamers and folding up chairs, but Darren had other plans. "Let's play a game," he said, twirling a basketball on his finger. "What kind of game?" Sarah asked, already annoyed. "Ghost in the Gym," Darren replied with a mischievous grin. "We turn off all the lights and see if we can make it from one end of the gym to the other without getting tagged by the ghost." "That's so stupid," Lindsay said, though she glanced nervously at the dark corners of the gym. Darren ignored her. "Come on, it'll be fun. Plus, we'll see if the legend's true." Sarah sighed. "Fine, one round, and then we finish cleaning up." Darren grinned and hit the light switch. The gym plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. The air seemed to grow colder immediately, and their footsteps echoed ominously against the hardwood floor. "Ready or not, here I come." Darren's voice boomed, and Sarah and Lindsay giggled nervously, scattering in different directions. Sarah crept along the bleachers, her heart pounding. The gym felt different in the dark, larger, emptier, yet somehow suffocating. She heard Lindsay's hurried footsteps somewhere near the stage and Darren's playful taunts echoing from the other side. And then she heard something else. A soft, rhythmic thudding, like a ball bouncing. She froze, straining to listen. It wasn't Darren. She could hear his footsteps far away. The sound was coming from the middle of the court. "Darren, cut it out," she whispered, but he didn't respond. The bouncing grew louder, more insistent, echoing off the walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sarah's breath hitched as a cold breeze brushed past her, carrying the faint scent of sweat and mildew. "Sarah?" Lindsay's voice trembled from somewhere nearby. "Over here," Sarah hissed. She stepped out from the bleachers, squinting into the darkness. Her eyes adjusted slowly, and she could make out a figure standing at midcourt. "Darren?" she called. But the figure didn't move. It was too tall, too still, and in its hand was a basketball, slowly bouncing in perfect unnatural rhythm. "Darren, stop messing around!" Lindsay's voice was sharp, but it quivered with fear. "That's not me," Darren's voice called from the far side of the gym. The three froze as the bouncing stopped abruptly. The figure tilted its head as if noticing them for the first time. Then, it took a step forward. Sarah grabbed Lindsay's arm. "Run," she whispered. But before they could move, the figure vanished. For a moment, there was silence, oppressive and suffocating. Then, from behind them, a deep, raspy voice said, "You shouldn't be here." Sarah turned, her flashlight shaking as she shone it behind her. There was nothing there, just the closed gym doors. But when she turned back, the figure was inches from her face. Its eyes were empty sockets, black and bottomless. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin as it held out the basketball, now dripping with something dark and viscous. "Play with me," it whispered, the words slithering out like a snake's hiss. Sarah screamed, dragging Lindsay toward the exit. Darren was already there, pounding on the doors. "They're locked," he yelled, his voice cracking with panic. The gym lights flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed across the walls. The figure stood motionless in the center of the court, watching them, its head tilting unnaturally from side to side. Then, it moved. 1 second it was on the court, the next, it was in front of Darren, slamming him against the door with inhuman strength. He gasped for air, his eyes bulging as the creature leaned in, whispering something none of them could hear. Darren's body went limp, sliding to the floor. "Help me!" Lindsay sobbed, tugging at Sarah's arm. They turned and bolted toward the stage, scrambling up the steps and ducking behind the curtains. Sarah pulled out her phone, but the screen was dead. "We have to get out of here," Lindsay whispered, tears streaming down her face. Before Sarah could respond, the curtains parted slowly. The creature stood there, its twisted grin wider than ever. It raised the basketball, its surface now pulsating as if alive. "You wanted to play," it rasped, throwing the ball with impossible force. It struck Lindsay square in the chest, and she collapsed, her body convulsing as a dark mist seeped out of her mouth. Sarah screamed, running blindly toward the emergency exit. She threw her weight against the door, and this time it gave way. She tumbled onto the cold pavement outside, gasping for air. When she looked back, the gym was dark and silent. Darren and Lindsay were gone, the doors swinging shut as if nothing had happened. The next day, Sarah tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed her. The janitor claimed he found the gym spotless, no sign of Darren, Lindsay, or the basketball. But Sarah knew better. Every night since she hears it, the sound of a ball bouncing just outside her window, waiting. The bell tower of Crestfield High loomed over the school like a grim sentinel, its clock face cracked and stuck forever at 3:33. Nobody went near it. Nobody dared. The door to the bell tower was bolted shut and covered in rusted chains, and a faded sign warned, "Keep out." For decades, students whispered about the girl in the tower. The story went that a girl named Emily had jumped from the top during the 1970s after being humiliated by her classmates. Since then, it was said she haunted the tower, her spirit vowing vengeance on who disturbed her resting place. Most dismissed it as urban legend, a scary story meant to thrill freshmen. But some, the ones who had stayed late after school, claimed to have heard her, a soft, mournful sobbing echoing from the locked tower. It was a Friday evening when Mia, Will, and Kayla found themselves near the bell tower. They'd been filming a short horror movie for their film class and had accidentally stayed too late. The hallways were deserted, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead as they packed up their gear. "Do you think we could get a shot by the bell tower?" Will asked suddenly, nodding toward the door at the end of the hallway. Kayla scoffed. "Are you serious? You know the story." "That's exactly why we should do it," Will said with a grin. "It's perfect for our film. Creepy, forbidden, maybe even cursed. Classic horror vibes." Mia hesitated. She wasn't particularly superstitious, but the bell tower had always unnerved her. Still, she didn't want to be the one to back out. "Fine," she said reluctantly. "But just a quick shot. I don't want to be here all night." The three made their way down the hallway, their footsteps echoing ominously. When they reached the door to the bell tower, they paused. The chains rattled faintly as if moved by an unseen breeze. "This is so dumb," Kayla muttered, but Will was already unhooking a crowbar from his gear bag. "You brought that," she hissed. "Just in case," Will said with a wink. It took a few tries, but eventually the chains fell to the floor with a loud clang. Will pushed the door open, revealing a spiral staircase winding upward into darkness. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic like rust or blood. Let's go, Will said, turning on his flashlight. Kayla shook her head. No way. I'll stay here and guard the door or whatever. You two have fun. Mia swallowed her unease and followed Will up the stairs. The steps groaned under their weight, and the air grew colder the higher they climbed. Graffiti covered the walls, and cobwebs draped across the ceiling like tattered curtains. When they reached the top, Mia stopped in her tracks. The room was small and circular, with a massive bell hanging in the center. The floor was littered with broken glass and scraps of paper, and in the corner a single chair faced the window, as if someone had been waiting. This is perfect, Will whispered, setting up his camera. He pointed it toward the chair. Mia, sit there and look out the window. Pretend you're the ghost. Mia hesitated but eventually complied, lowering herself into the chair. It creaked ominously beneath her. As Will adjusted the camera, a faint sound reached their ears. It was distant at first, like a sigh carried on the wind, but it grew louder, morphing into a low, guttural sob. Did you hear that? Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Probably just the wind, Will said, though his hands shook as he adjusted the lens. The sobbing grew louder, closer. Mia's skin prickled as she glanced toward the window. A faint reflection stared back at her. Not hers, but a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes. Will, she whispered, her voice breaking. There's someone. The bell rang. The sound was deafening, vibrating through their bodies as if the air itself was screaming. Mia clamped her hands over her ears, her vision swimming. When the ringing stopped, she realized she was alone. The camera lay on its side, its screen cracked. Will, she called, her voice echoing in the empty tower. A faint whisper answered her. Turning slowly, Mia saw the chair she had been sitting in. It was no longer empty. A girl sat there, her hair matted and wet, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. Her eyes, dark and bottomless, locked onto Mia's. Why did you come here? The girl whispered. Mia stumbled backward, tripping over the broken glass. The girl stood, her movements jerky and unnatural, as if her limbs didn't quite work right. Do you want to see how it feels? The girl rasped, stepping closer. Mia scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding as she darted for the stairs. She raced down the spiraling staircase, her breaths ragged, her pulse thundering in her ears. The whispers followed her, growing louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. When she reached the bottom, the door was closed, and Kayla was nowhere to be seen. Mia yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She turned to run back up, but the whispers turned into screams, and she froze. Emerging from the shadows was the girl, her head still tilted, her mouth twisting into a grotesque grin. Mia's scream died in her throat as the girl reached out a hand. You shouldn't have come, she said, her voice a chorus of overlapping tones. And then, everything went black. The next morning, the janitor found the door to the bell tower wide open. There was no sign of Mia, Will, or Kayla, only the camera lying on the floor. When the police reviewed the footage, they saw the three enter the tower, but only two climbed the stairs. Oak Hollow High had a history of strange disappearances, but the worst was what happened to the Detention 7. It started as any other day, a mix of boredom and teenage rebellion. 7 students had been assigned after-school detention, each for different reasons. The room was 204, an old classroom tucked at the end of a long, rarely used hallway. Miss Grayson, the stern and perpetually irritated teacher in charge, left the students to their own devices after a curt warning. Stay in your seats, no phones, no talking. She stepped out briefly, mumbling about needing more coffee. The students, Ben, Lila, Marcus, Priya, Chloe, Jared, and Danny, sat scattered across the room, each in their own bubble of frustration. The clock ticked loudly, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the dingy gray walls. The air felt thick, as though the room itself were suffocating them. Then the lights flickered. Old building, Ben muttered, leaning back in his chair, but the flickering didn't stop. Instead, the lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the desks. Ms. Grayson? Chloe called, but there was no response. The door creaked open slowly, but no one was there. A chill swept through the room, making Priya shiver. Did anyone else feel that? She whispered. Marcus rolled his eyes. Relax. It's probably just a draft. But then the clock stopped. The second hand froze at exactly 3:16, and an unnatural silence fell over the room. No buzzing lights, no creaking pipes, not even the distant hum of the hallway fans. Just silence. And then came the knock. It was faint at first, a soft tapping at the window. Lila, who was seated closest, glanced over. Who the hell? Her words cut off as her face went pale. The others followed her gaze. Outside the window was a face, but it wasn't human. It was pale and elongated, with eyes too large and too dark, like polished stones. The mouth stretched unnaturally wide, as if it were trying to grin but didn't know how. It tapped again, its long fingers pressing against the glass. "Is this a prank?" Jared said, his voice shaking. "It's gotta be a prank." The creature's head tilted slowly, its movements stiff and wrong. Then it pointed toward the door. The door slammed shut on its own, and the overhead lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Chloe screamed, and a scuffle of movement erupted as everyone reached for their phones, their flashlights creating narrow beams of light in the pitch black. "What the hell is going on?" Marcus shouted. "I don't know," Priya cried. Her light flickered, and for a brief moment she thought she saw something in the corner of the room. A shape, crouching, too tall to be human. "Stay together," Ben said, his voice low and steady. "Don't split up." The door to the supply closet at the back of the room creaked open. Every flashlight whipped toward it, illuminating shelves of dusty books and broken equipment. "There's nothing in there," Lila whispered, though her voice cracked. And then the closet door slammed shut with a deafening bang. From the back of the room, a deep, guttural growl filled the air, reverberating through their chests. The sound was primal, filled with malice. The lights of their phones flickered, and in that strobe-like chaos, they saw it. A figure, hunched and towering, its limbs impossibly long and clawed. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting their terror. It lunged. Screams erupted as the group scattered, knocking over desks and chairs in their frantic attempt to escape. Jared made it to the door first, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he screamed. Behind them, Marcus let out a strangled cry as the creature grabbed his leg, dragging him into the shadows. His flashlight rolled across the floor, casting eerie, spinning beams of light. "Marcus!" Chloe screamed, but he was gone. Ben grabbed a chair, swinging it wildly at the creature as it emerged again. The chair splintered on impact, but the thing didn't even flinch. It turned its glowing eyes toward him, its mouth stretching into a grotesque mockery of a smile. "Run!" Ben shouted as it lunged for him. The remaining 6 bolted, breaking for the windows. Jared smashed one with a desk, but when they looked out, their stomachs dropped. There was nothing outside. Not the schoolyard, not the street, not the sky, just endless, inky blackness pressing against the broken glass. "We're trapped," Priya whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No," Ben said, his voice shaking. "There's got to be a way out. There's always a way out." The creature stalked toward them, its movements jerky and unsettling, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. As it neared, the shadows around it seemed to writhe and pulse, swallowing the light. Lila grabbed Chloe's hand. "We stick together. No one else gets left behind." But then the clock started ticking again. Slowly at first, then faster and faster, the sound growing louder until it was a deafening roar. The creature froze, its head snapping toward the clock as if summoned by it. 3:16, Chloe whispered, staring at the frozen time. That's when the lights came on, blindingly bright. When they blinked and looked around, they were back in the classroom. No broken windows, no chains on the door, no creature, and no Marcus. The remaining 6 students sat in stunned silence, their breaths ragged. Miss Grayson opened the door, looking annoyed. "What's all this racket? Detention's over. Go home." They stumbled out into the hallway, the world outside the school bright and normal. But as they left, none of them could shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, they learned that room 204 had been sealed off decades ago after a group of students went missing. And on the blackboard of that abandoned room, written in jagged, claw-like script, were the words 316, never forget. The students at Redwood High knew better than to go near room 103 after dark. During the day, it was just an old storage room filled with dusty textbooks and outdated equipment. But at night, it was different. There were whispers about strange sounds and flickering lights. Some said if you went inside at midnight, you'd hear the cries of students who'd never left. No one knew exactly what had happened there. Some claimed a teacher had gone mad decades ago and locked a group of students inside. Others said the room was cursed because it was built over an unmarked grave. Whatever the truth, the school janitors refused to clean it, and the staff kept the door bolted shut. But on a dare, 4 students, Emma, Tyler, Rachel, and Josh, decided to investigate. "It's just an empty room," Josh said confidently as they stood outside room 103. He rattled the doorknob, but it didn't budge. "See? Locked. Guess we're done here." Tyler smirked and pulled a small metal pick from his pocket. "Not so fast. Where did you even get that?" Emma asked, crossing her arms. "Internet," Tyler replied, shrugging. "I've been waiting for a chance to use it." Within minutes, the door clicked open, revealing a dark, musty room. The faint scent of mold and something metallic wafted out. Rachel hesitated. "This is a bad idea," she muttered, but the others pushed ahead. Inside, the room was colder than the rest of the school. The air felt heavy, and their flashlights cast long, distorted shadows on the peeling walls. Broken desks were piled in the corner, and the floor was littered with crumpled papers and shattered glass. "See? Nothing to be scared of," Josh said, but his voice echoed unnaturally, as if the room were far larger than it appeared. As they moved further in, Emma noticed something odd. The walls were covered in faint scratches, as if someone or something had clawed at them. What do you think made these?" she asked, running her fingers over the grooves. "Rats," Tyler suggested, though his bravado was fading. "Big rats," Rachel muttered, her flashlight shaking. At the back of the room, they found an old chalkboard covered in smeared writing. Emma wiped away some of the dust, revealing words written in jagged, uneven script. "Help us." Her stomach tightened. "Okay, we've seen enough. Let's go." "Wait," Tyler said, pointing to the corner of the room where an old trapdoor lay partially concealed under a pile of debris. "What's that?" "Don't," Rachel said firmly. "Seriously, Tyler, don't." But Tyler ignored her, clearing away the debris and prying the trapdoor open. A rush of cold air hit them, carrying the stench of decay. A narrow staircase spiraled down into darkness. "Nope," Josh said, backing away. "No way. Not going down there." But Tyler had already started descending, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. "Come on," he called back. "It's probably just an old basement." Reluctantly, the others followed. The stairs creaked under their weight, and the air grew colder with every step. At the bottom, they found a small, cramped room lined with crumbling bricks. In the center was a wooden table, and on it lay an old leather-bound book. "Check this out," Tyler said, picking up the book. Its cover was embossed with strange symbols, and the pages were filled with handwritten notes and diagrams. Emma leaned closer, frowning. "It looks like a journal or a spell book." Rachel pointed to a phrase scrawled repeatedly on one page. "We must seal it. Do not let it escape." "What do you think they meant by?" Josh began, but he was cut off by a loud bang from above. The trapdoor had slammed shut. The group froze, their breaths visible in the icy air. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to a person. "Someone's up there," Emma whispered, clutching Rachel's arm. "Maybe it's a teacher," Tyler said, though his voice shook. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then a low, guttural growl echoed through the basement, vibrating the walls. "Run," Josh whispered, his voice breaking. They bolted for the stairs, but as they reached the top, they found the trapdoor wouldn't budge. Tyler pounded on it, shouting, but the growling grew louder, now accompanied by a wet, slithering sound. Emma turned, her flashlight shaking as she shone it toward the darkness. That's when she saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that bent the wrong way. Its face was a pale, featureless mask, and its eyes glowed a sickly yellow. "Don't look at it," Rachel screamed, pulling Emma away. The creature lunged, its clawed hands swiping inches from Tyler's back. Josh grabbed a broken pipe from the ground and swung it wildly, hitting the creature with a sickening crunch. It didn't even flinch. "Go, go, go," Emma shouted. As the creature closed in, Rachel noticed the book lying on the floor. She grabbed it and flipped through the pages, her eyes landing on a crudely drawn circle surrounded by symbols. "Guys, we have to draw this," she yelled, holding up the page. "Are you kidding me?" Tyler screamed. "It's the only way," Rachel insisted. They scrambled to find anything to draw with, eventually using a shard of glass to carve the symbols into the floor. The creature was nearly upon them, its glowing eyes locked on Emma when Rachel shouted, "Now!" Josh grabbed the book and read the Latin incantation scrawled on the page. The creature shrieked, a horrible, ear-piercing sound that made their heads throb. As the last word left Josh's lips, the creature dissolved into black smoke, which was sucked into the symbols carved on the floor. The room fell silent, save for their ragged breathing. When they finally forced the trapdoor open, they didn't speak. They didn't stop running until they were out of the school and back in the safety of the streetlights. The next day, the school announced that room 103 was being permanently sealed. No explanation was given. But late at night, when the halls were empty and the lights flickered, some swore they could still hear it. The sound of something clawing at the floor, trying to get out. There was a legend about the last stall in the girls' restroom on the 3rd floor of Ridgewood High. Everyone had heard the stories. Late at night, if you were brave or foolish enough to enter the restroom alone, you'd hear knocking from the last stall. Open it, and you'd see her, a girl with pale, bloodless skin, her eyes hollow and black. They called her Lily. No one knew who Lily really was. Some said she was a student who had been bullied until she took her own life. Others whispered that she was an accidental death the school tried to cover up. All anyone knew was that the last stall had been bolted shut for years, its hinges rusted over. Sarah didn't believe in the supernatural. As far as she was concerned, the story of Lily was just an urban legend to scare freshmen. So when her friends dared her to spend 5 minutes alone in the restroom after the school's Halloween party, she laughed and agreed without hesitation. The hallway was eerily quiet as Sarah approached the restroom door. The lights above flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows across the floor. She glanced back at her friends, Amy, Claire, and Jess, who were standing at the far end of the hall, giggling nervously. 5 minutes, Sarah called out. This is going to be the easiest dare ever. She pushed open the restroom door. Inside, the air was stale, tinged with a faint metallic scent. The stalls stretched out before her, each one with a faded number scratched into its metal surface. The last stall sat at the end, its door slightly ajar despite the chain and lock that should have kept it closed. Sarah felt a prickle of unease but shook it off. It's just a story, she told herself. With her phone's flashlight in hand, she stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind her. The room was silent except for the faint dripping of a faucet. She leaned against the sink, her eyes on the mirror. The glass was smeared and cracked, distorting her reflection. She smiled to herself, rolling her eyes at the absurdity of the dare. Then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic knocking. It came from the last stall. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound continued, steady and deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. Her rational mind fought to take control. It's just the pipes, she thought, or maybe her friends messing with her. She turned her flashlight toward the last stall. The door creaked, swaying slightly as if moved by an unseen hand. Very funny, guys, Sarah called, her voice trembling. I'm not scared. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah's pulse quickened as she edged closer to the stall. Okay, you win, she said, her voice wavering. I'm leaving. As she turned to go, the door slammed shut, the echo ringing in her ears. The faucet began to drip faster, the sound sharp and insistent. Sarah rushed to the door and yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She pounded on it, shouting for her friends, but the hallway outside remained silent. Then came a whisper. Sarah. She spun around, her flashlight flickering as the temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath fogged the air as she stumbled backward, the beam of light shaking in her trembling hand. The last stall door was now wide open. Inside stood a girl. Her skin was pale as bone, her hair hanging in matted, wet strands around her face. Her eyes, empty, bottomless pits, locked onto Sarah. Why did you come here? The girl asked, her voice low and guttural. Sarah couldn't speak. She couldn't move. The girl stepped out of the stall, her bare feet leaving wet, bloody prints on the tiled floor. I was alone, the girl said, her head tilting unnaturally. And now, so are you. The lights flickered violently, and the room filled with the sound of distant laughter, high-pitched and cruel, like the echoes of forgotten torment. The girl's mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, revealing jagged, blackened teeth. Sarah screamed and dropped her phone, the flashlight spinning wildly across the floor. She backed into the sink, her hands scrambling for anything to defend herself. The girl advanced, her movements jerky and unnatural. Stay away, Sarah cried, but the girl only laughed, a hollow, rasping sound that sent shivers down her spine. Just as the girl reached out, the restroom door flew open, and light from the hallway spilled inside. Sarah's friends stood there, their faces pale with fear. "Sarah, what the hell's going on?" Amy shouted. Sarah turned, but the girl was gone. The last stall door was closed, the chain and lock back in place as if it had never been opened. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she bolted past her friends and out into the hallway. "We have to get out of here," she choked out. Her friends didn't argue, but as they fled down the corridor, Jess glanced back. Just for a moment, she saw the restroom door slowly swing shut, and in the mirror above the sink, a pair of hollow black eyes stared back. Every school has its secrets, but Meadowbrook High had one that no one liked to talk about: the Forgotten Locker. It stood at the very end of the East Wing, number 329, its paint chipped and rusted. No one used it, and no one dared to. Students avoided walking past it, and even the janitors refused to clean near it. The air around the locker always felt wrong, cold, heavy, like it was watching you. The story went that decades ago, a student named Hannah Mitchell had disappeared without a trace. Her locker had been number 329. No one knew what had happened to her, but strange things started happening after she was gone. Lockers slamming shut on their own, whispers in the empty hallways, the feeling of being followed. Eventually, the school administration sealed Locker 329 shut and pretended it didn't exist. That is, until Alex, a skeptical senior with a taste for the supernatural, decided to investigate. "Come on," Alex said to his friends, Mia and Eric, as they stood in front of the locker late one Friday night. The school was empty, save for the occasional creak of the old building settling. "It's just a dumb story. We'll open it, prove there's nothing inside, and get out of here." Mia glanced nervously down the hallway. "I don't know, Alex. This place gives me the creeps. Let's just go." Eric, trying to act braver than he felt, chuckled nervously. "What's the worst that could happen? It's a locker, not a portal to hell." "Exactly," Alex said, grinning as he pulled a crowbar from his backpack. "Let's see what all the fuss is about." With one swift motion, Alex jammed the crowbar into the lock and pried it open. The locker door groaned, metal screeching as it swung outward. Inside was darkness, unnatural, impenetrable darkness, as though the space beyond the door didn't belong to the world they knew. The faint scent of damp earth and decay wafted out, making Mia gag. "See? Nothing," Alex said, though his voice lacked conviction. He leaned closer, shining his flashlight into the void. "Wait, there's something back there." Eric stepped forward, peering over Alex's shoulder. "What is that?" At the back of the locker was a small bundle of old yellowed papers tied together with a red ribbon. Alex reached in, his hand trembling slightly, and pulled the bundle out. The ribbon crumbled to dust as he untied it, revealing pages filled with scrawled writing. The words were erratic, desperate, smeared in places like they'd been written in a hurry or by someone in fear. "She's here," Alex read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "She's watching me. I can't get away." Mia stepped back, her face pale. "This is a bad idea, Alex. Put it back." But Alex flipped to the last page, where a single sentence was written over and over. "Don't open the door." Before they could react, a loud bang echoed through the hallway. They all jumped, spinning around to see nothing but shadows stretching toward them. That was just the wind," Eric stammered, though the windows were closed. The lights flickered, and a low, guttural moan filled the air. Mia grabbed Alex's arm. "We need to leave. Now." As they turned to go, the locker slammed shut with a deafening clang. Alex dropped the papers in shock, and they scattered across the floor. And then they heard it. A soft, shuffling sound from inside the locker. Something was moving. "Run!" Mia screamed, pulling Eric and Alex down the hallway. The sound grew louder, more frantic, as though whatever was inside was clawing its way out. The hallway lights flickered again, and for a moment the three of them saw a shadowy figure reflected in the polished linoleum floor. It was tall and thin, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles, its face obscured by a tangle of dark hair. They reached the front doors and burst into the night, gasping for air. For a moment, everything was silent, except for the sound of their own ragged breathing. "What the hell was that?" Eric demanded, his hands shaking. "I don't know," Alex said, clutching his knees, "but we're not going back." Mia looked back at the building, her face pale. Through the glass doors, she could see the faint glow of the hallway lights and the outline of the locker. The door to locker 329 was wide open again. The next Monday, the three of them tried to act normal. But whispers started spreading through the school. Some said they'd heard screams coming from the East Wing over the weekend. Others swore they'd seen someone, standing at the end of the hallway, just staring. By Wednesday, Alex didn't show up to class. Eric and Mia went to his house, but his parents said he hadn't come home the night before. That evening, Mia's phone buzzed. It was a text from Alex's number. The message was short, just 2 words, "Help me." Mia stared at the phone, her hands trembling, and then just as she was about to reply, a second text came through. A photo. It was Alex, his face pale and terrified. Behind him, she could just make out the edge of a locker, the number 329 scratched deep into the metal. It was nearing the end of the school year when the students of Windermere High started whispering about the hallway that doesn't exist. It wasn't on any map, and no teacher ever mentioned it. But students swore that if you wandered the school late enough, especially near the north wing, you might find yourself in a hallway you'd never seen before. At first, the rumors were brushed off. Just another creepy story to mess with freshmen, people said. But then, a senior named Caleb disappeared during detention. The security cameras showed him walking toward the north wing, but he never left. After that, the school installed extra locks and cameras, but the rumors only grew stronger. Sophia, curious and skeptical, decided to find out for herself. She loved mysteries, and the idea of a hidden hallway intrigued her. So one Friday evening, after the school emptied out, she convinced her friend Nate to stay behind and investigate. "You realize this is the setup to every horror movie ever, right?" Nate asked as they crept through the dimly lit halls. "Stop being dramatic," Sophia said, holding up her flashlight. "It's just a building." But as they approached the north wing, the air seemed to shift. It grew colder, heavier, and the usual hum of fluorescent lights faded into an eerie silence. "This place gives me the creeps," Nate muttered. They rounded a corner and stopped. In front of them was a hallway neither of them had ever seen before. The walls were lined with faded lockers, their paint peeling, and the floor was scuffed as though hundreds of feet had shuffled across it over the years. But the strangest part was the dim, flickering lights. They weren't the bright LEDs used in the rest of the school. These were old, yellowed bulbs, casting long, ominous shadows. "Okay, that's weird," Nate admitted, his voice shaky. Sophia stepped forward, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. "Maybe it's just an old section they closed off. Then why isn't it locked?" Nate asked, staying close behind her. As they moved deeper into the hallway, they noticed something odd. The lockers were all ajar, their insides filled with old, rotting papers and books. The smell of mildew hung in the air, mixed with something metallic. Sophia stopped in front of one locker that had something scratched into the door. "Turn back." Maybe we should listen to that," Nate said, glancing nervously down the corridor. Sophia ignored him and kept going. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. It felt like they had been walking for miles, yet every time they turned around, the entrance was nowhere in sight. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," Nate said. "Let's go back." Sophia hesitated, but before she could respond, they heard it, a faint sound, like distant footsteps. "Who's there?" Sophia called, her voice echoing unnaturally. The footsteps stopped, and then they started again, faster, closer. "Run," Nate whispered, grabbing her arm. They sprinted back the way they'd come, but the hallway didn't end. The lockers stretched endlessly on either side, and the dim lights buzzed louder, flickering violently. Suddenly, they saw it, something moving in the shadows ahead. A figure hunched and twitching, its limbs impossibly long. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but its eyes, glowing white pinpoints, stared directly at them. Sophia screamed, but the sound seemed swallowed by the air. Nate yanked her backward, and they darted into an open classroom. Slamming the door shut, they pressed their backs against it, panting. "What was that?" Nate whispered, his eyes wide. Sophia didn't answer. Her flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing rows of desks covered in dust. On the chalkboard, written in shaky, smudged handwriting, were the words, "You can't leave." The door rattled behind them, the handle twisting violently. Nate grabbed a chair and wedged it under the knob, but the banging grew louder, more frantic. "We have to find another way out," Sophia said, her voice shaking. They scrambled toward the back of the room, where a small window overlooked the courtyard. Nate struggled to open it while Sophia kept an eye on the door. The banging stopped. The silence was worse. It pressed against them, heavy and unnatural. "Did it leave?" Sophia whispered. Nate shook his head. "I don't think." Before he could finish, the lights in the room flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The only light came from Sophia's flashlight, which began to flicker as well. In the faint beam, they saw it again, the figure standing in the corner of the room, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It moved closer, its limbs jerking with every step. Nate screamed and threw a chair at it, but the figure didn't react. Its glowing eyes locked onto Sophia. "We're not getting out," she whispered, her voice hollow, and then everything went black. The next morning, the school was abuzz with police officers and reporters. 2 students had gone missing, the latest in a string of disappearances tied to the North Wing. The security footage showed Sophia and Nate entering the hallway, but after a certain point, the camera feed cut to static. The school board announced plans to seal off the North Wing permanently. But late at night, students claimed to hear footsteps coming from behind the barricades. Sometimes they swore they heard faint whispers. And if you stood near the hallway long enough, you might feel a pair of eyes watching you from the dark. There was a challenge that circulated among the students of Crestwood High called the Midnight Bell. The rules were simple. Stay inside the school after midnight, find your way to the main clock tower, and ring the ancient bell. No one knew who started the dare, but everyone knew the warning that came with it. If the bell rings back, you don't leave the school. It sounded like a joke. The bell, after all, was broken, had been for decades. But that didn't stop students from sneaking in and attempting the challenge. Most came back with stories about eerie noises or flickering lights, but they always made it out. Until Jessica's brother Mike didn't. Mike had taken the challenge on a dare a year ago. He never came home. The police said he must have run away. There was no sign of him in the school or anywhere else. But Jessica didn't believe that. She knew Mike. He wouldn't just leave. So, on the anniversary of his disappearance, Jessica decided to take the challenge herself. She waited until the janitor locked up for the night, then slipped inside through an unlocked basement window. The school was eerily silent in the dark, every creak and groan of the old building amplified. Her flashlight cast long, flickering shadows on the walls as she made her way to the main staircase. The clock tower loomed above her, its face cracked and dark. The bell hadn't rung in over 50 years, but legend said it would ring at midnight for anyone brave or foolish enough to climb up and pull the rope. Jessica wasn't sure what she expected, but as she climbed the winding staircase to the top of the tower, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air grew colder with every step, and the shadows seemed to shift around her. When she reached the top, the room was smaller than she'd imagined. The massive bell hung overhead, tarnished and lifeless, its rope swaying gently in an unfelt breeze. She glanced at her phone, 11:58 p.m. "Almost time," she whispered, her breath visible in the icy air. The minutes ticked by, agonizingly slow, but at last the clock struck midnight. Jessica grabbed the rope with trembling hands and gave it a hard pull. The bell didn't budge at first, but on her second attempt, it let out a deep, resonant clang that echoed through the school. She exhaled shakily, waiting for anything to happen. Nothing did. Jessica let out a nervous laugh. "Guess it's all just a clang." The bell rang again, louder this time, shaking the floor beneath her feet. Jessica froze, her heart pounding. She hadn't touched the rope. Clang! The bell rang a third time, the sound reverberating through her skull. "Hello?" she called out, her voice small and shaky. No answer. But then she heard it. Footsteps on the stairs below her, slow, deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. "Mike?" she whispered, clinging to the hope that it might be her brother. The footsteps stopped just outside the doorway to the bell room. Jessica's flashlight flickered, and for a moment she thought she saw a shadow move across the wall, tall, distorted, with unnaturally long limbs. She stepped back, her heel hitting the edge of the platform. "Who's there?" A voice answered, low and guttural, echoing as though it came from the bell itself. "You rang." The figure stepped into the room, but its face was not human. It was pale and stretched, its features twisted into a permanent scream. Its eyes were black voids, pulling Jessica's gaze into their depths. She stumbled backward, but the figure moved faster than anything should be able to. In an instant, it was in front of her, its cold, claw-like hand wrapping around her wrist. "Where is he?" Jessica screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Where's my brother?" The creature's mouth split open impossibly wide, and from its throat came a chorus of voices. Among them, she heard Mike's. "Run," his voice whispered. "Don't look back." Jessica yanked free and bolted for the stairs. The bell rang again, the sound deafening, as if chasing her down the steps. The shadows along the walls writhed and reached for her, their clawed fingers just brushing her arms and legs as she fled. She reached the ground floor and didn't stop running until she was outside. The school loomed behind her, silent and still, as though nothing had happened. But the sound of the bell still echoed faintly in her ears. Jessica never spoke about what she saw that night. But the following week, the school announced that the clock tower was being permanently sealed off after reports of structural instability. A month later, during a thunderstorm, neighbors reported hearing the old bell ring 3 times. The next morning, a janitor found a single shoe at the base of the tower steps. It belonged to Jessica. She was never seen again.